All right, our group is studying Native American populations and suicidality. My name is Cooper.
My name's Kelsey.
My name is Arjun.
And I'm Gabriella.
Okay, so first we're going to be looking at our target group of Native Americans and the condition of suicidality prevalent amongst them. So I found this article from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Minority Health, and it just focuses on some overall suicide statistics among American Indian and Alaska Natives. So first off, in 2019, suicide was the second leading cause of death for American Indian and Alaska Natives, ages 10 to 34. And another key statistic here was that overall suicide death rate for American Indian and Alaska Native adults is approximately 20% higher than that of the non-Hispanic white population. So from our textbook by Cockerham, it does a really good job of breaking this down into two specific groups, males and females, and the risks that are faced for both groups. So first off, for American Indian and Alaska Native males, they face a significantly heightened risk of suicide compared to the general population. Two factors that were worth highlighting for me were age of peak risk and mortality rate comparison. Between the ages of 15 to 45 for males, they face the greatest risks, where on average, and for the rest of the population, the risks are faced after the age of 40. And in the year 2017, their rates were 32.9 per 100,000 compared to 14.5 per 100,000 for the rest of the population. So this shows a clear disparity as they're more than double. Their rates are more than double that of the general population. So turning to females now, there's still significance in highlighting their rates, as it is 12.1 per 100,000. So not as pronounced as the males, but still a significant concern. And this just goes to show that this issue is not confined to one sole population. It's happening in men, it's happening in women, and there's urgent need for targeted interventions and support systems to address this critical public health issue. So it's worth noting that these health facts previously provided failed to provide a fuller understanding of the social factors that are associated with suicidality amongst Native American populations. So a really critical article from CNN published this year, actually in 2024, has some great takeaways, discusses historical trauma, which just pretty much talks about how colonization, forced relocation, and policy through the government have inflicted intergenerational trauma on these communities. This is a perpetual cycle of mental health challenges. Also, political neglect plays a huge role, as there's been a lack of political investment and attention on these suicide prevention programs on reservations, where in other programs, such as the Department of Veteran Affairs, there's a huge proactive effort for suicide prevention. And here's some key quotes that are highlighted from the article as well that talk about structural inequities and underfunded resources, services available.
And I'll be defining critical race theory. So this is a quote from Professor Kimberly Crenshaw of Columbia Law School. It is a way of seeing, attending to, accounting for, tracing, and analyzing the ways that race is produced, the ways that racial inequality is facilitated, and the ways that history has created these inequalities. So there's four different foundations of critical race theory that I want to touch on. Number one is race consciousness. For far too long, we've utilized a colorblind approach when identifying public health crises, and just assuming that the experience of every population affected by these crises experience them the same. Race consciousness basically argues that we need to understand that Black populations, Native American populations, white populations all experience this society differently, and we need to be conscious of this. There's also an important foundation surrounding shifting perspectives. And this basically argues that we need to stop utilizing majority population opinions and stories and quotes and information to tell the minority experience. We should be using firsthand information and knowledge from minority populations to tell their own story and use that to make informed decisions regarding policy and public health interventions. On top of that, also, it just identifies that racism is systematic. Specifically as it pertains to Native American populations. Number one, voter disenfranchisement and census undercounting. This kind of plays into the larger governmental role in terms of our systems, but essentially it relates to government funding. So if populations are undercounted, then they don't receive the amount of funding they would need to fight crises such as suicidality rates. Also, lived experience, it kind of plays into that race consciousness, but basically it says that lived experience is imperative and coming to understand why certain health disparities happen. Yes. This diagram basically just shows what CRT does in terms of understanding health disparities. Without utilizing CRT, we would identify a disparity, in this case, suicidality, and then we'd say, what's the condition that's causing this? And then, however, CRT forces us to look one step past that and say, what is the systemic failure that's allowing this condition to persist? One example we talked about in class, cancer rates are higher in urban Black populations. We decided, or it is found that environmental toxin exposure is to blame. But CRT says, why are environmental toxin exposures higher in these populations? It's because of redlining, which is a systemic and judicial failure. And then lastly, there's two shifts in perception that come with CRT. Number one, that racism just comes from a few bad people in our society and their unmoral and unjust opinions, but rather identifying race as something that is woven into our societal fabric. And then the second shift is that we need to stop looking at person-specific conditions and identifying these societal conditions that allow those to persist. For example, let's say Johnny has lung cancer because he works a job that exposes him to carcinogens. Instead of just stopping there, we need to understand, why can't Johnny obtain a higher paying job that doesn't make him be exposed to these carcinogens, and how can we help him get there?
Okay, so I'm going to be going over the policy proposals. So the racial cultural framework for addressing suicide-related outcomes in community of colors. The central thesis of this article was that people of colors, race and culture experiences should guide theory, research, and practice associated with suicide-related outcomes in communities of color. There's three main parts, which are the constructs, how does systemic inequalities and oppression contribute to suicide-related outcomes, the populations, which populations should be given more attention to, and the interventions. So what can be done? So the racial cultural framework article advises for psychologists to look just beyond acculturation and racism, but to focus more explicitly on the stress which comes about when navigating two different cultures. This involves switching the techniques from focusing on individual level constructs to more macro level. It's believed that acculturation is a more important factor than was previously thought. And when it comes to psychological distress, this can lead to suicidal ideation. So one really important policy intervention that we thought was keeping kids in school. So according to the CNN article, lots of kids don't go to school, and adverse childhood experiences can have a cumulative effect on suicide risk and the tribal identity. So strong connections with family and friends and staying in school were found to be protective against suicide. And the second is to allocate more mental health resources, so free funding for psychological help programs in schools. So the cause of high suicide rates in Indigenous communities is a very complex topic, and Native Americans often live with the weight of more adverse childhood experiences compared to other populations. There's factors such as emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, substance misuse, mental illness, parental separation, high levels of incarceration, and policy. These could all be contributing factors. So these adverse experiences are all consequences of something that is called intergenerational trauma, which is caused by racial discrimination, colonization, their forced relocation and removal from their land, and government-sanctioned abduction to boarding schools that persisted until about the 1970s. I think that for this reason, the government should allocate more funding and resources to kids and to everyone, just to have more free counseling centers, crisis hotlines, as well as strengthening access to telehealth for mental health concerns for those that can't physically show up if they don't have means of transportation, so that they could do it online, as well as increasing the training and hiring of American Indian or Alaskan Native healthcare workers so that they can have someone that they feel they can relate to and understand their struggles and feel open to talking to. And then the last intervention was participating in more research plus an increase of governmental funding. So more tribal nations are interested in governmental funding in order to expand their knowledge base and try to find a solution. However, this funding is kind of hard to come by. So anyways, the racial framework kind of goes over 3 parts, which is examining the contributions of systemic racism, the communities of color, and then the interventions. And we can all apply this to hopefully help these communities in the future do better.
So I'm going to be applying critical race theory to our subject, and that's through psychological ramifications of genocide. We can look at how they were removed from tribal lands and how they were forced to assimilate into American culture. So first, it's important to understand that historical trauma is caused by the experience of traumatic events or transgressions, and it is cumulative and transgenerational, so passing generations. It causes psychological harm to an individual, group, or an entire generation. So there was purposeful genocide of the Native peoples, and the government actually prevented Native Americans from mourning these losses when in 1883 they established a court of Indian offenses, which prevented them from doing spiritual ceremonies such as the sun dance to grieve and mourn these losses. And that remained in effect until 1978 when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed. Next, acculturation. Acculturation is assimilation or becoming similar to a dominant culture. This forced acculturation on Native Americans gave a loss of ethnic identity and a disruption of tribal unity, which are both protective factors against suicide. And as Gabby talked about earlier, children were taken to schools off of reservations. Many of them went missing. Many of them experienced sexual assault and violence. And most of these children now are grandparents if they survived, and they have grandchildren, and then passing on this trauma to their grandchildren is what is that historical trauma. And it's important to take a look at Western education and how the American government wanted to force Christianity on the Native Americans. So a lot of their spiritual connections have been lost, and therefore they're having a harder time dealing with harder emotions and trauma. So what does this mean for Native adolescents today? This means an increased risk of mental and physical distress and unable to utilize their tribal support system because a lot of the tribal characteristics have been taken away due to acculturation and trauma factors by the American government and laws. And Native adolescents now struggle to gain strength from their indigenous culture. These are our 5 key takeaways. And these are our references.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.